with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful
Guyana will become the next Dubai, and we, the citizens of Guyana, are super excited to benefit from our homeland the same way the citizens of Dubai benefit from theirs.
This is what life is like for citizens from the Emirate of Dubai. When you are born, your parents pay nothing. Your delivery and checkups for the next 9 months are all free. Then you grow up and you go to school. Local school in Dubai is free. And so are universities, because Dubai will pay for you to get a degree.
I studied at Zayed University and New York University, both for free.
Who's gonna pay for that?
The government.
Then you get married. If you can't afford the wedding, you get $20,000 to throw a wedding. And after marriage, every local Dubai family gets this: free land. Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Yes.
Did you get free land?
Sure, yes.
And if you cannot afford the home, then you get a grant to build it for free.
I also can't afford building a house. I can get a 0-interest loan on housing.
Zero?
Zero.
If you need to go to the hospitals are free. And if you need surgery that's not available here, they will fly you to another country to get treatment for free. When you become a senior citizen, you get discounts, many discounts. And if you live alone and can't afford it, Dubai will even send a caretaker to look after you for free. And when you die, well, in Dubai, that's also free. Your funeral will be taken care of, and Dubai will build a full tent with air conditioning within 5 hours of your death next to your home, so your friends can come and say goodbye to you.
Guyana will become the next Dubai.
with wonderful people all over this country. She is a beautiful Guyana.
Good evening, viewers. We have an interesting and different program tonight. I think you'll find that it's the first of its kind that Globespan has presented. Thanks to Noor Singh and his group, thanks to Devin for providing the forum and the occasion for what should be an interesting and collegiate discussion between two Guyanese who are distinguished, highly educated, come with good credentials, and I believe are each in a position to give us some guidance and give us some information and give us some insight with a fair and hopefully unbiased context on a subject that is topical now, and I am sure will continue to be of interest, at least for the next week, even with the short-term memory of the public that we see as guided by social media. My name is Timothy Jonas. I am a Georgetown Guyanese living in Guyana. And with me, I would like to introduce on this panel are Dr. Kimani Nahusi, who is a professor at Temple University of African Languages and African Studies, all housed under the word Africology. He is a Guyanese and a loyal and patriotic Guyanese, affirmatively so, from Queenstown, Essequibo. Also on this show is Dr. Ganga Prasad, who is a former Minister of Local Government within the government of the People's Progressive Party. Another loudly patriotic Guyanese from Lenora on the west coast of Demerara. I am very glad to introduce these two gentlemen to you and to advise you that the subject which the three of us shall be discussing is the importance of regional democratic councils in Guyana, a subject which, of course, is topical and of interest now, given that we have recently seen the campaign and the conduct of the local government elections in Guyana. The novelty of this particular discussion is that, as you see, there is no narrator, there is no moderator. It's just three people who either will be agreeing or will be butting heads. The very gentle rules of engagement, which will not be strictly or scrupulously refereed, will be that each speaker tries to restrict his statements or his contributions from time to time to a period of 2 or 2.5 minutes so that there can be a rebuttal. And of course, the gentlemen on this forum are academics and come with a background of some political expertise and some academia. So I suspect you will find that there are not the usual interruptions and talking over each other. And I hope that you will find that the conversation is both productive and informative. So I cannot say welcome, gentlemen, because I'm not a host, but having been asked to introduce, I wish to say I am very privileged to be on this forum with the two of you. Now, the topic being the importance of the regional democratic councils in Guyana, I believe that probably a good starting point for the discussion would be to review the conception behind the creation of the councils, what the intention was. And Ganga, with your permission, I'll ask you to lead off on that, given your history as a Minister of Local Government. And perhaps you can give us the background, the intention, and we can start from there.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. To all our viewers, a special good evening, and to my colleagues on panel. It's a great feeling being with the two of you guys on this program this evening. Yes, the topic is one of that can provoke lots of discussion, particularly at a time when we're just coming out of local government elections in Guyana. The importance of regional democratic council is something that every Guyanese can identify with. But as they're described today, that wasn't how they were many, many decades ago. Before the 1980 Constitution, Guyana had a system of governance that supported national government and national governance. The system was called locally the district commissioners system, where Guyana was divided into 7 districts, and each district was headed by a district commissioner whose district was subdivided into various parcels described as sub-districts, and each was headed by an assistant district commissioner. With constitutional changes as a result of that referendum in 1979, what we describe as 12 of 1980, that Act 12 of 1980 brought in force this concept of regional democratic council. And Act 12 of 1980 would have given the wide parameters as to the roles, functions of these regional democratic councils. Those are captured and are still captured under Chapter 2809, Laws of Guyana, which had significant revision by Act 15 of 2000. That would
So
have.
what is the purpose of the councils, Gangan, and how are they expected to operate?
Well, there are 10 councils. Guyana has been divided into 10 geographical areas, and each would have been described as a region in itself, and they're governed by the Regional Democratic Council. So the whole intent at bringing these councils into force was to get greater involvement of citizens in making key decisions that of political, socio-economic nature that can trigger or support the development of their respective communities. And so it is against that background that the regional democratic councils would have come into being.
Kimani, do you think that's, I'm sorry, Gang, do you think that has successfully been achieved, Kimani?
Yes and no. There have been successes in some areas, and I think there have been a distinct lack of success in others. I was keen to hear what Dr. Prasad was saying, because I need to, well, I have some responses there. I don't know if you'd come to the end of your articulation of the intention of the councils, Ganga, if I may call you, full-mouth Ganga.
No, that's all right, and I welcome that. Yeah, apart from the political, economic, social aspects that would have mentioned, the cultural life, cultural aspect was one that I omitted, but I can leave it there and then we can continue from there if it's okay.
That's good for me.
Tim?
So so again, Kimani, you said that you think it's failed in some areas and succeeded in others. In what way?
All right. In order to really understand what I would mean by success and failures, and I do really think we have a mixed bag, I want to step back a bit and ride on what Dr. Ganga said. It was a district commissioner system before, that's during colonial times. And its duty was to support the central government. Now, we could argue about what support means and that kind of thing. And I think I'm going to be a little bit biased here, and I don't care so much about being biased once we understand where my bias is coming from, you know, and once it's genuine. And I think that the history of colonialism in Guyana is a history of oppression, repression, substantially. That's the greater part of it. And this becomes important because in order to erect that system of district commissioners, local government, what the British did, and the Dutch and French for a short time, was oppress the indigenous peoples of Guyana. These were the first people who lived there. And they had well-organized communities with a system of governance. So that was destroyed. Sometimes they were pushed into the interior and substantially neglected. So that's one of the things we need to be very careful to note. Secondly, African Guyanese who were enslaved and won their freedom in, well, partial freedom, and especially partial freedom of association and so on. These were physical restrictions that were lifted. I'm saying this because I want us to understand that the mental restrictions were not lifted, and we were still in economic bondage. We still substantially so. as a direct result of those systems. In order to run that district commissioner system, first of all, during the time of formal enslavement, African people had no rights. Secondly, immediately after the legal termination of certain aspects, physical aspects of the system of enslavement in 1838, African Guyanese launched a huge movement. The vision was to create a civilized alternative to the barbarism that white people subjected us to on the plantations. Part of that vision is well known. African Guyanese did what is called the cooperative villages. We all know about people put pennies in wheelbarrows and bought villages and blah, 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 or bought land upon which they erected villages, to be more correct. Now, that was an African response to an enhanced opportunity to be themselves. Of course, there were the fighters against enslavement, maroon communities who left the plantations and established their own independent communities. But here we have African people erecting a system of local government that came out of their own experiences and cultural inclinations. That movement was repressed by the British under the district commissioner system. Of course, there was negotiation and so on, but it was substantially repressed. Later on, Indian Guyanese began to join those villages. Portuguese Guyanese began to join those villages. There was friction, there were certain levels of exploitation, but there was also substantial collaboration in those villages so that people became something. And I think it's important that in our attempts to understand the 1980 Constitution and its intentions, that we measure them. We measure that Constitution and the provisions, the structures, against what had, shall we say, existed there before, but had come out of people's experiences. And I would argue more substantially out of people's experiences. Also, I'm very glad that you talked about the intention of the act. And I'm not going to quarrel with it. I don't think anybody in their right minds will quarrel with the intention of that act. But it is the impact upon people and the structures that it provided for that I think we must be very careful about as we analyze. Last word. It's significant that you mentioned culture and the whole question of development. You cannot develop a people without developing their culture. And this means history, it means their traditions. And in Guyana today, we don't talk enough about race or culture. We avoid it or we talk about it in a negative way. We cannot understand ourselves as Guyanese unless we understand ourselves as Indian Guyanese, African Guyanese, Portuguese Guyanese, mixed race Guyanese, because all the peoples who were brought to Guyana or who came voluntarily came with culture, with histories of doing things in certain ways. We neglect knowledge of that to our peril. And generally, we don't know enough about ourselves and about each other. It varies according to cultural groups. But all of this, I think, is part or should be part of our intelligent discussion on local government.
So I'm trying to connect the history that you just described, including the abolition of slavery in the 1830s and the subsequent purchase by ex-slaves of a number of plantations, and the migration of some ex-slaves to maroon colonies, which I was not aware of in Guyana as much as elsewhere, like Suriname, for example. I wasn't aware of that as a large thing in Guyana, but thank you for that. But I don't see the connection between that and the conversion in 1980 of district councils to the 10 RDCs which were created. I understand from Ganga, and for the audience, you will have heard Kimani use the lovely Guyanese expression full mouth in terms of how we are in this forum addressing each other by first names. And I would just like you to know that before the program started, we had agreed to take that very American approach just for the sake of simplicity and equality. So I know it is not a natural Guyanese thing, but that was the agreement beforehand. So please understand that this was just to get past the formalities and the delays which sometimes occur with formalities. But it seems to me that the purpose of the RDCs must be treated as trying to decentralize power from central government to sub-districts, in this case 10 councils, in the hope that those councils have a more direct connection with the people who live in the region and therefore are more directly accountable to those people and have a more personal relationship with those people. Do you think that that is a plausible interpretation?
I think so, Tim. I think you hit the nail on the head there. But before I continue with my response to the statement you've just made, are you through there, Tim? Can I?
Oh, yes, please. There was a question.
Yeah. And let me just back up a little bit with what Kimani would have stated and your question with regards to seeing that connection between the 1980 Constitution and what Kimani was saying with regards to the RDCs. There is some degree of connection because it is from the village movement in itself that we got the other tiers of local government, like the community, the rural, and the neighborhoods. In that way, then, it all really reinforced the need, as Tim is saying, for some decentralization. That is moving governments a little closer to the people, so to speak. And the very first tier that was identified for that was that vehicle that is called the Regional Democratic Council. I think the decision makers in those days would have recognized the need to shorten that distance between communities and central government. So that was the first step that came into being, the Regional Democratic Council. Another point that I wish to agree with Kimani was that of culture. From a sociological perspective, culture in itself gives us that great insight into people living in societies. And Guyana, beautiful as she is, we must recognize that that diversity, which is Guyana's strength, that diversity is not evenly dispersed around across our country. And so there are different emphasis on certain cultural practices, belief systems, and so on in different parts of our country. Kimani mentioned about the first people being pushed further into the hinterland of Guyana. And so the regions themselves would have followed some pattern, some degree of unevenness, for want of a better word. Because when you look at the geographic size of the regions, you may find more comfort in terms of some degree of equity. But when you look at population density within the 10 regional administrations, you have some serious difficulties there. And so that bit is something that have always raised, for me, as such, looking for how we can um, maybe bring a little bit more equity into it. For example, let me say the largest geographical region in our country is region number 9. But the most populated region in our country is region number 4. And when you look at the city of Georgetown in itself, you know, that would have taken in so many of our region's population, and still have little extra to give. So in that context, then, regional development, I can agree with the sentiments that it has brought, it was necessary, it is still necessary, and it was intended to take government closer to the people or get people closer to government, whichever you choose. And maybe that gave birth to the neighborhood democratic councils, because the country in that period, 1980, I think it was T.A. Earl who was charged with that responsibility of demarcating boundaries, which would subsequently be called local authority areas. But let me leave that to you guys. And
the thing is that
yes,
I'm not sure that a discussion of culture relates back to a sense of placing responsibility for either recognizing, educating, or developing cultural issues on RDCs. I am concerned more with the question of the autonomy of the RDCs. You see, the fact is that no, small as we are, central government cannot, a couple ministers, control the whole place. There has to be some kind of devolution of power, some kind of delegation of power. And to me, that is done through the RDCs. And in fact, it's not really a delegation of power, because it should be the award of power by the people who are living in the regions who appoint their representatives. But to me, concomitant with that, and necessary to accompany that, must be autonomy of those councils. And the only way for them to have autonomy is for them to be financially independent. Now, I see as one of the major failings of the entire system that the government of the day, whichever government it has been in turn, has systematically removed the power of the RDCs to be financially autonomous. And therefore, each council is entirely beholden to the central government for subsidies, for handouts, so that they can do any work. And that effort that I see in central government to retain power through the purse strings by removing the ability of what should be an autonomous council to charge its rates, to collect its own revenue, and therefore to do the job that it should be doing, that has led us into all kinds of chaos. Not so?
I would start by agreeing with what you said at the end, Tim, but I want to step back a bit in order to explain why I agree with it, and also to explain that why I have tremendous disagreements, to use a strong word, with it. I would start with this proclamation of reality. My ancestors were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. And it has been the job of the people who oppress us, and many people who unconsciously, unwillingly inherited those ways of thinking and doing, to posit that African people don't have any culture, that we are nothing. And I think it's important that in anything we do, we recognize the contributions of African people to humanity. We were the first human beings. We created the first civilizations, plural, in the world. African people led the world for over 3,000 years in Kemet, ancient Egypt, blah, blah, blah. I'm saying this in order to say that the enslaved Africans who were taken to Guyana didn't arrive there without culture, without a very long tradition, the longest tradition of history in the world, social history, including ways of organizing that we need not talk about here. We could talk about the boxer, box hand, communal parenting, a whole lot of things we could talk about. I'm telling you this in order to identify culture that existed in the villages built by African people as not merely a vibrant thing, but a very, very important thing in local government. Dr. Prasad mentioned the RDCs. That's very important because this is the ground level of participation, organization, and participation. I said that I'm from Queenstown Village on the Essequibo Coast. As a teenager, I was involved in village affairs. I was the secretary of the community committee. And when the people of Queenstown had a village meeting, everybody and their dog attended. This was consistent. In those villages, women, and I'm talking now from the beginning, the inception of these villages, women were equal to men in terms of anything in that village administration. A British governor in the 1860s, a man named Woodhouse, passed a diktat that said women and poor people must not be involved in the affairs of the villages. Now, we could talk about the specific impact of that, but what I want to articulate here also is the deeper question of not merely tension, but the oppressive tendencies of the colonial state towards those villages. You mentioned financial independence. Well, those villages were surrounded by hostile taxation that made it impossible for them to strive. Don't want to go into the details now, but the last thing I want to say is that it's a result of this culture. And Indian people would come, Indian people had their own tradition of the pan chariot. You know, so there was a really great experiment going on, not without some level of occasional friction. We need to be very clear about that. But I think that what was emerging from the Guyanese experience was an authentic indigenous response to our conditions. And I see the imposition of this local government that we have now in the 1980 Constitution, even though it was for the best intention or with the best intention, I see that as an artificial imposition, and I do mean that word, upon villages. And I think that looking at participation, which is one of the goals of this, local participation would tell you a story. I don't know, I'm not on the ground now, and I don't know if there's been a resurgence of participation. But I know a few generations ago, a village was a village. You didn't go there and, you know, there was nobody and nothing happening. Each village had a village council, it had a church, it had a sports club, it had a music group, it had certain things, a shoemaker and so on. And I think that, you know, learning to understand what our people were constructing, not without difficulties and so on, we got to understand. I think it's important for us to see anything, any structures coming out of that as being rooted in that experience and in the structures that were thrown up by those people. My last word is this. I don't think that in the best of times there will be no tension, perhaps even conflict, between a national government and local government constituencies. And I think that in the original PPP, this was experienced, partly because in the original PPP, when in 1953, the PPP, United PPP won political power, a substantial portion of the people who were called to central government, not necessarily as ministers, but also as ministers, were people who were leaders at the village and regional levels. And there was some amount of not only concern, but deficit inherited from that. I'll stop there.
Tim, yeah, I want to say that I share some of your concerns with regards to the autonomy of the regional democratic councils. The act in itself would have provided several safeguard mechanisms. The reality, as Kimani was explaining a little bit, is that each of these regions are powered differently. In other words, the type of natural resources that are available. And then, as I mentioned before, variables such as population density and the kind of level of development in some of those RDC areas. When you talk about the kinds of road network you will find in region number 8 in comparison to what you will find on a coastline region and so on. All these are variables that would have impacted and to some extent may have created what you would have described as this perceived lack of independence enjoyed by some of the regional democratic councils. I wish to agree that we need to do a little bit more to enhance the independence of the regional democratic councils. And I think that that is a statement which we would not have too many disagreements on. The other thing, however, is that in whatever we do, it can be across the board. It has to be unique to the geographical area and what exists within the boundaries of that geographical area that is called a regional administration. And why I say so, it is because I look at what was happening with regards to subvention to local authority areas, municipality, as well as neighborhood democratic councils. And you try to use, for want of a better mechanism, you try to use equality rather than equity. And so in that equality process, you found that everybody got the same amount, but the needs varied from entity to entity. And you do not want to create such a kind of situation with your regional democratic councils as well. While you don't want that, some may argue that that is exactly what is existing. So if I can just quickly, for the benefit of our viewers, I know you gentlemen, you're fully aware of it. Each of the regional democratic councils themselves, they are responsible for preparing their budgets. And preparing their regional budgets, what they do is that they have in-depth consultations with their local authority areas. And I think they depended on the local authority areas to have consultations with each village, each community in arriving at their bid that they will take to the RDCs. And the RDC then too depends on recommendations coming from what is called the Regional Education Committee for all the schools and education in that region, the Regional Health Committee from all the health centers, hospitals and so within that region, from the Infrastructure Committee for Infrastructure Growth and Development, Public Works in the region, similarly for agriculture, and so on. So there are different components that would have had input in making that budget. then the budget goes through that process for Parliament and so on, and then the approval and so forth. But I agree with Tim in that the revenue base, if expanded outside of what is given by Parliament, that in itself may add a little bit more of independence to the council themselves. But as it stands, in this present mechanism, there is built-in involvement of people, and decisions are really driven by the people. However, the source of funding remains that of the Parliament.
Well, I'm not sure it's that of the Parliament. You see, where the outside of towns in the rural areas where the NDCs and RDCs are concerned, there is a negative veto by the minister. So if the minister can veto your budget, you're shot, you're dead. And that unilateral power is problematic in itself because it assures continued control by central government. Now, I have a problem with that. And in fact, I was going to respond to Kimani because he is, to my mind, focusing on a historical account of the evolution of culture. But to my mind, the RDCs are there to serve the people. And I think that was the conception in 1980 and before 1980. So somebody got to pay to weed your parapets, somebody got to pay to dig your drains, somebody got to pay to maintain your streets, and somebody got to pay to carry away your garbage. And it is those functions that fall to the RDCs and the NDCs, and they need to be provided with the wherewithal to do it. Now, unfortunately, that hasn't been happening. So we had a situation that I was taken aback at how flagrant it was, where Barra Jagdeo the other day in the campaign run-up in Georgetown said that if PPP wins Georgetown, they will release funds to help Georgetown turn into the garden city it once was. Now, implied in that is the threat that if they don't win Georgetown, you will remain a garbage city. And that is unacceptable. That is a terrible situation, but that is the reality that we face. So I think that our first failing and our first problem that we have to accept is that as long as central government can dictate to the RDCs, we will continue to live not just in a garbage city, but in garbage neighborhoods where you got to pay private people to collect your rubbish and where you drive through potholes and your drains don't drain properly, so you flood in the rainy weather because the services are not maintained because the councils can't afford it unless they go begging for money from central government. And if that is the system, then the solution to the system can only be to explore how do we give these councils autonomy so that the councillors are answerable to the citizens, the residents that live there. And if they don't do their job, they're fired by those residents. So there's direct democratic accountability. But on the flip side, they are equipped financially with the means to collect enough revenue to do the job they're supposed to do. And that has failed and continues to fail. And that, to me, doesn't have anything to do with culture or history. That got to do with the determination by central government to hold on to their power and the failure by our leaders to accept that it is in everyone's interest to give autonomy to these councils so that they are accountable to the people, answerable to the people, but also equipped with the financial wherewithal to do the job that they're supposed to do. So I could have some clean parapets and well-maintained drains.
Well, Tim, what you have just said in terms of Barra Jagdeo and the Garden City is a repetition of the history of Guyana. Because what I was pointing out demonstrates exactly what you were talking about. The central government, immediately after 1838, strangled village development And they did it through starving the villages of taxes, tax money. Tax raising was socialized. Sorry, tax raising was at public, but it was very public. Everybody who had this had to do that. I'm going to explain something about that just now. But the distribution of those funds went mostly into the estates. So immediately after then, there was a shift in the type of taxes, direct to indirect. Also, a raft of taxes were brought in, aimed at the villagers. If you had a donkey, you had to pay a tax on that donkey. The estate had 300 and 500 mules, no tax. If you had a ballyhoo, you had to pay a tax on that ballyhoo. The estate had hundreds of farms, no tax. And it continued like that. How was that tax money distributed? Most of it went to the estates. So you had a system that functioned exactly in the way in which Barrett Jagdeo threatened to make the central government function in the specific instance of if Georgetown was won by the PPP, and also by implication, what is happening right now when Georgetown is not under the administration of a PPP-controlled council. So history has demonstrated what you were fearing and illustrating. And I think it's important that we understand that those villages that were erected throughout Guyana were villages that were shaped by cultural responses to that environment. So it has everything to do with culture. Culture in this case is not people jumping up on a stage and singing certain songs or beating drums and that kind of thing. Culture is your way of life. It's how people live, how they discharge their daily organization of life. It's the values and principles upon which that village or community or family or town or whatever organization is built. And that's why I mentioned that women were equal, because those villages have a history of gender equality to speak about. But we have generally neglected our history, and when it was written, it wasn't written from the standpoint of the working people. It was written from a Eurocentric standpoint. So a lot of what was happening in those villages has gone unnoticed or underreported. So I think that, yes, everything about the evolution of those village councils is relevant and indeed important, and I might add desperately so in certain circumstances, to what is happening and what is not happening in local government administration right now. And I want to run on and say one or two other things addressing Dr. Ganga's contribution. You know, we've been talking about people in geographical areas. And I know that you mentioned this. In a certain way, you have to look beyond the geography. You have to look at, you said, villages and communities, and I agree with that. Who are these villages? Who are these communities? You mentioned the RDCs. You were the first to do that on this program. And it's an important point because, like I said, that's the ground level of participation. Therefore, we've got to ask questions. In some RDCs, villages with a deep tradition, historical tradition of organization, were joined to more recent settlements. Usually, that is a distinction between a predominantly African Guyanese village and a predominantly Indian settlement. And the two historical experiences are not necessarily the same. But even without historical experience, when one group of people have an allegiance to one political party and another group has a different allegiance, in our Guyanese experience, that is often been problematic. I could tell you that in my village, a pump that was there from since I was a small boy, and that's many epochs ago, it was removed and taken to an Indian settlement. Now, if that was a singular occurrence, you would not have noticed it. But the least you could do is wonder if this is what we will call politically motivated. Now, I don't really care too much about whether it happened and what kind of reason it happened for, although, yeah, I care about that. But to me, the most important thing is that we have to see these local government areas as ways of doing Guyanese citizens the best. So the removal of suspicion, to my mind, is a very important thing because we know our country. And we must act in ways that involve people, genuinely involve people. So this returns to your statement of the original intention, and I don't disagree with it, of the Local Government Act. We have to get the best ways of involving our people genuinely in their own affairs. I think education is part of this, but I rest my case again on that intention, and I also want to flag up once more this fact that it doesn't matter how good our intentions are, there's bound to be some kind of tension between the central government and the local democratic organs. You could only erase that by acting in good faith consistently. So that sometimes, even though people might disagree with you, they say, oh, you can come around, or the government can come around, or something of the sort. To me, it's difficult to achieve. But I think that transparency, openness, and a willingness to meet people and discuss things and admit all points of views that are relevant is a good way to start.
Right. Gentlemen, let me say the first statement Tim made took me by a little bit of surprise, and that is Minister vetoing budgets. I don't know whether I missed a key function of mine, but that's not so. I don't think the system has anything inherent in which ministers will veto budget, BU, whichever government is in place. What happens is that the regional democratic councils are not the ultimate policy-making bodies. And so the regional administration act as conduits for the policies of the Ministry of Education, policies of the Ministry of Health, policies of the Ministry of Agriculture, to some extent Public Works, and administration. So in that light, if we understand that context, what happens, and I'm sorry I have to take a few minutes of our time to go this way. Let us say, for example, the education budget coming out from region number 4. That budget is approved by the Regional Democratic Council after proper presentation and scrutiny. But then that budget goes to the Ministry of Education. The Ministry of Education will check to see whether the key policy areas of that Ministry of Education is embedded in that budget for education for that particular region. And then an approval is given. If the perusal found something wanting, then there are avenues of correction and amendment. Then it goes to the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development. So those are inherent to ensure that government's policies for different areas are being implemented. That does not take away from regional inputs, as I explained before. So if that is called vetoing, well, then I agree. Otherwise, I disagree with that because there isn't any system like that. What their system is to ensure that there are proper due diligence, ensuring that the policies that are being funded or the policies for which funding are being sought are in keeping with that of central government. When it comes to the statement that was alleged to have been made by Vice President Bara Jagdeo, I can't say much because I haven't really listened to the context. I don't have the full context in which that statement was made or was not made. But I would have preferred that the context in itself would have been brought forward. However, having said that, when it comes to municipal governance, the reality is, and as we mentioned Georgetown, every cent that is paid by taxpayers in the city, and this would actually respond to a statement made by my friend Kimani, every cent that taxpayers pay in the city of Georgetown, those rates and taxes go to the coffers of the municipality of Georgetown. It don't go to any central government. All rates and taxes paid by residents or citizens within the municipality or any neighborhood democratic council goes into the coffers. They have full leeway as to how they spend that. They also get subventions from central government, annual subvention. It is those subventions that central government will require through the Ministry of Local Government and Regional Development proposals as to how that subvention would be utilized, because the subvention can only be used for capital works. Unlike what some municipalities were trying to do, to use subvention to pay wages and salaries. So the thing is that we must see the context and we must understand the reality of what is happening in our country. We've got to be careful with some of the generalized statements that we make. So this bit of, if Mr. Jagdeo would have said that or didn't say that, or in whatever context he would have said it, that would not have taken away from how the city ended up being the garbage city as it is today. Certainly, the PPP has never held the reign of power in that municipality of Georgetown since independence to now, you know. So it means, therefore, and then the other thing in terms of, I get a feeling that this bit of withholding funding from the municipality by using the statement, alleged statement made by Mr. Jagdeo. The concept there is that you've been getting the rates and taxes. What have you been doing with them? Tim spoke about generating revenues. The Act, the Municipal and District Council Act, Chapter 2801, allows municipalities to generate their revenues. You know, one would recall the municipality of Georgetown made a bold step. They signed an agreement for parking meters in the city of Georgetown. The citizens said they don't want that. The citizens stood up against that. That matter now is causing, not the municipality of Georgetown, it is causing the citizens of Guyana millions of dollars to have a legal representation on that case that was filed by the parking meter bit. So I don't want to go too long away from that, but just because these statements were made, the concept of regional democratic council, I think We all agree it is a useful concept. It is a tier of government that is very much needed, and it is supported by other tiers of government. And so, gentlemen, that's my little two-bit at this stage. Yes.
Well, let me respond to that.
Go right ahead.
I think there are a couple things that need to be cleared up immediately. I noticed that you talked about the councils preparing their budget, and I agree with that. The councils prepare their budget, and of course, the budget is the amount of money that they expect to be spending on cleaning parapets, drains, fixing roads, removing garbage, and doing what you want a council to do to make your place livable, which we know has not been done in Guyana, which is not why we just have a garbage city, but all the areas are in a state of disrepair. But when you say that it is for them to raise their money and they have autonomy, we're a nation of laws, and I can immediately point you, I notice you refer to the Municipal and District Councils Act. Section 158 of that act says that the minister may approve the estimates of the town council or district council, either as submitted or after affording the council an opportunity to make representations, with such variations or amendments as he sees fit. So twist it or turn it. You could talk about good intentions and good faith and all that kind of thing, but the minister decides how much money they're going to get. Now, you're quite right. The system contemplates that in an autonomous council, you go to the people that live in your area and you extract rates and taxes from them. You extract rates from them. The rates are calculated as a percentage of the value of the property where they're living. So a council should be able to say, I need $100 this year. And to raise $100, I see that the properties here are worth $1,000. So I can take 10% from each place. The thing is, the council can't do that if the minister has the right to say no. So that's the first problem that we have, that the minister has been vetoing and exercising his power because they like centralization of power. And I would say that in another Globespan forum, this came up, and Mr. Clement Rohi justified it by suggesting that central government doesn't want to increase the rates that people are paying. People are already paying a lot, and central government feels that more should be done in terms of subvention so that you're not raising the rates that people are paying. Well, that goes against what you just said. But what I would like to point out is that I can't imagine a more fair system than rates. Because if rates are based on a percentage of the value of your property, and you have a very big house, and I have a very small house, then you as a wealthy man will pay more rates, I will pay less rates. And if Kamani doesn't own any property and is so poor that he doesn't own property, he will pay no rates. I can't think of a more fair system than that. So if the council is going to get their money to clean the parapets, clean the garbage, dig the drains from rates, and the minister refuses to allow the council's budget when they say this is how much we will need for the year, and Mr. Rohi justifies it by saying, don't worry, central government will subsidize, we don't want to raise rates. We have already upended the apple cart and messed up the system, which is why I got potholes on my road now. Because every time we need a road done, the council has to go hat in hand to central government and say, please for money. And then central government comes and publishes it in the paper and puts up a big sign, project of central government. Look, we are coming to save you from the crisis we have put you in by building a road here for you in this council that we have no business building because the council should be doing it as an autonomous entity. Now, to go to the other point you made, I'm sorry, there's one other problem with that, but I'll get back to that. You make a good point, and I agree with it halfway, that in the town, we call Georgetown a garbage city. The main city council collects rates and it goes straight to their coffers. I agree with you. However, that is not the end of the story, is it? Because the fact is that, again, the rates are calculated as a percentage of the value of the property. And under the same legislation, there is an obligation imposed on the chief valuation officer every 5 years to value the properties so that a fair rate can be levied on those properties. Now, in Georgetown, there are buildings that are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Those buildings went up in the last 5 years, in the last 3 years, in the last 10 years. The face of Georgetown has totally transformed in the last 10 years, let alone 20 years. But the chief valuation officer has not done a valuation since 1996. So he has been disempowered from doing a valuation of properties in Georgetown. The boundaries of Georgetown since then have gone from Eastern Highway east all the way to Cummings Lodge, all the way to include University of Guyana. They've gone south all the way to Houston, Rome, to include Agricola. And yet, because there has been no valuation, those new properties which are brought into the city are not liable to rates and taxes. And the rates and taxes that are paid on 1996 valuations. So you got people with skyscrapers worth hundreds of millions of dollars that paying $40,000, $50,000 a month rates and taxes. Now, you must agree that in those circumstances, if we have an enlarged city, so we not just have a place where you're digging drains up to Eastern Highway. You now got to dig drains and fix roads in Sophia, in Agricola, in Houston. You got a huge operation that needs to be done, but you have no increased revenue because the same value of properties since 1996, when we had little wood buildings, where now we got skyscrapers, and those people paying small amounts, all going to the city coffers, but woefully inadequate because the government has refused to empower the chief valuation officer to do his job to value so people could pay fair rates. People must pay fair rates or else they will starve. City council cannot do its job given the expanded job. And that is why we have a garbage city, and no amount of media coverage, so in government officials walking around picking up rubbish and putting it into bags, is going to change that. There is one area I will agree with you on. And to me, this is equally important because it creates a chicken and an egg situation. The PNC run city council has, for the last 50 years, 40 years, been increasingly incompetent, corrupt, useless. You have delays that are unnecessary. It's a bureaucratic jungle. They're trying to do things illegally that they ought not to do to get more revenue. They're taking salaries. They're not doing their job. And the question is legitimately asked, you give these people more money in City Hall, what are they going to do with it? But equally, the question must be asked, if you don't give them enough money to do their job, how can you criticize them if the city is a garbage city? Now, for me, there has to be a solution. And to me, the solution has got to be that, first of all, we got to change the rule that instead of the city appointing councillors, and then those councillors appointing the mayor, so that the mayor is not answerable to the citizens of Georgetown, the mayor is happily ensconced, protected by his party immunity. He is protected by his party loyalty. So we have seen a progression of mayors who can't win an election on their own. And if you doubt me, you could look at Miss Patricia Chase Green, who went over to the PPP in the last run-up and did not do very much for them in terms of the number of votes she won. So we need direct accountability to the people. And the only way to do that is a more straightforward, clear-cut system of election that you elect your mayor and you elect your councillors separately, but your mayor needs to be directly answerable to you. And we need to revise the system of rate collection. Let the valuation officer value these properties so that a real amount of money can be collected sufficient to meet the needs of the city. And then if they're not doing their job, we get rid of them. And if we have a transparent system where we get rid of them, it will transcend the nonsensical politics we have with our Afro party and our Indo party. Because people at the end of the day want properly dug drains, good roads, and their garbage cleared every week. They don't want a lot. And we're not getting any of those things because of this tit for tat.
I like the closing part of your presentation, Ben. And I'm going to start by upholding that. And I want also to refer to something that Ganga said early on. You know, it's a beautiful principle, you know, equity and not equality. From, you didn't say this is not your exact words, this part of it, but from, you would recognize this, from each according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And there was something about that in the way in which you articulated the intention of the regional democratic system. And I agree and applaud all of that. I also agree that in the best circumstances, there's going to be disagreement, some level of it, between a central government and a local government for all kinds of reasons that are usually genuine. But I think that party politics has interfered with our local government system in ways that need not have happened. It's unproductive. The whole presentation of Tim showing how Georgetown, and these are not your words, have gone from being a garden city to a garbage city is a good illustration, at least in part, of what we're talking about. And we've got to be honest. Which national government that is really serious about development across Guyana would tolerate that kind of situation that has lasted for so long in our city, that people used to come to the country to see this wonderful garden city? Have we taken the notion of a garden city and tried to develop it? No, we have reversed it. And this is the situation before our eyes. We could point fingers all over the place. But the fact remains that the ruling party has been in power for most of the time. This degeneration, and that's the word, has been occurring. And responsibility must lie with that party. The other thing I want to say is that even by visual inspection, there has not been an attempt at equitable, not equal, but equitable distribution of resources across the communities in Guyana. And I would challenge any one of us to take a tour and look at paved streets and other amenities in areas where Indian people dominate and areas where African people dominate, and try to find out the difference and why the difference. I'm not telling you that all of this is always at the doorstep of the PPP, but I'm saying it's happening under the watch of the PPP. And I also know of instances where PPP cannot absolve responsibility for this. Now, all of this, to my mind, Tim talked about solutions, and I agree. Solutions are needed. We shouldn't just come and air our mouths and retire and drink a cup of tea or a beer or whatever, and that's the end of it. We need to offer solutions to our nation. And I agree with Tim that there must be something in a popularly elected mayor, and you might extend it to other areas too, because this may be one way of moving things forward, but one solution will not end the problem or alleviate it substantially. The evaluator must evaluate. There is a question, anybody who knows Georgetown, even a small bit, would know that there's a huge question of unpaid rates and taxes. It's been going on for many years. What's happening with that? Also, there are two other points I want to make. A central government must be prepared to make subventions in cases of need. Development is never going to be equal. And even if you have a relatively safe distribution of resources from the central government to different regional bodies or regions, there are going to be cases in which a region is going to want to try something. Let's say that a regional council wants to erect a husking machine that will going to turn the coconut fiber into ropes and other usable products. Well, if it is a well thought out project, I think the central government should have an interest in investing in something like that. That's only one example. The other point I want to make is this. Whose money does a central government spend? It might seem a very innocuous point, but it seems to me as though too many of our citizens are unaware that the central government spends their money and that that central government should be spending the money on behalf of them. In other words, in pursuit of their interests. This brings me to a question that all of us knows the answer to. How is it that so many citizens of Guyana appear unaware of the fact that the money a central government spends belongs to the people? Here's the key question. Why do not our people, the great majority of them, behave in ways that attempt to hold the central government responsible, that shows their knowledge and understanding of this question of whose money is spent by the central government? Let me demonstrate what I mean. It's very normal for a government official to go to a particular village or another and say things like, we are going to give you a basketball court. And people seem grateful for that, including people who've been starved of disbursements. They seem grateful. This government minister comes to give us something that is being purchased with our money because we're the people, we're part of the people. Why is there that mentality, that absence of a consciousness that this money belongs to all Guyanese people? And although we may not get what we want every time, we must make certain that this money is spent in the interest of people. So I would leave the discussion at this point with those questions, and I'll listen to what comes back.
Yeah, well, Kimani, I must say that I fully agree with you. The money that any government spends belongs to the people of that country, because the government in themselves don't put their own money into managing government's affairs. I go back a little bit to what Tim would have stated, and I like some of the suggestions that he would have brought on board, but I'm a little bit disappointed with his outlook towards taxes coming across as if rates, is the only form of revenue that is available to a council. That is very narrow. That is a very limited purview. The act in itself, the very one Kim referred to, the Municipal and District Council Act, has several suggestions as to revenue generating streams that can be pursued by entities. Any government, irrespective of whatever level that government operates, whether local, whether regional, whether national, must be conscious of the additional burdens that can be paid on the citizenry of any country or any geographical area by increase in rates and taxes. And so those who manage our affairs ought to look at ways and means of how we can generate revenue other than solely thinking, because we had recently in, couple of years back in this country, government that managed this country use exactly what Tim was postulating, increase rates and taxes on everybody. And it was terrible in this land. I think, you know. So we have to, I am in agreement with him. There's need for greater revenue, generation of revenue at whatever level. And so to do that is that we just have to look at other sources and not, as we say, kill the goose that lays the golden egg. When you overtax the citizens, you're impoverishing them. How you think they will help you in beautifying and maintaining and, you know, have an appreciation for anything? So that is something that we need to really get going. Another point I wish to make clear to all of us here, and that is, the discourse is on regional development in itself. But there is something that we need, and I think we gentlemen, we all understand this, but for viewers, I need to reinforce it. The municipality of Georgetown has special favors in the laws of this country. While it is in region number 4, the regional administration has no directional input or otherwise within the boundaries of the municipality of Georgetown. It is so special. That is in our laws. Central government too has limited intervention in the municipality of Georgetown because that is specifically named in the act. And so I'm not trying just to justify anything for anybody. What I'm saying is that the city needs to recognize its obligation and responsibilities to the citizenship. Unless that happens, you can never have any of the things that we are all speaking of. There are the things that are needed. They are the ingredients for bringing greater joy, happiness, and comfort into the lives of people. But if you're given responsibility and you don't take your responsibility seriously, or worse yet, you don't know your responsibilities, then certainly we would not achieve much. The other bit in terms of the chief valuation officer and so on, I don't think Tim has that one correct, because my understanding is that about 2-3 years ago, well, might be a little bit more, about 5 years ago, there was a massive valuation exercise that took place in Guyana, in the municipality of Georgetown, in the municipality of New Amsterdam, in the municipality of Linden, causing the taxpayers of this country, because it wasn't the municipal funds, and Kimani, you're correct, it is the taxpayers' funds that was used. Large sums of money was given out to contract to do that valuation exercises. That is an area in which we need to get our acts together. And I recognize, like Tim, that the landscape, particularly in the city, over the past number of years would have changed, particularly when you look at existing infrastructure, buildings, and so on within the city. And so, yes, valuation in itself can help to cause people to pay their fair, as Tim said here, fair share of rates to whichever entity. My final comments with regards to communities, which Kimani said some communities, and he used Afro-Indo. I wouldn't want to go down to that, because for me that's a myth. That's not reality. Whatever exists in Guyana whatever exists in Guyana exists in every village. If you got some paved streets in one village, you will find paved streets in so many other villages. If you got a street that is a mud street, you will find that in all villages, irrespective whether green, white, blue, as Kimani called them, whether Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, you find them there. Guyana is a country that is developing. The three of us are thoroughbred Guyanese. We love this country, and we really love this country. We want the best for this country.
Thanks for that, sir.
Some of us we're becoming a little bit impatient in terms of seeing that happening because of our age and so on, all the hair on my head gray, and so I do appreciate that. What I'm saying to us is that sometimes we give legs to some statements that was applicable maybe in history, but not really evident in the present. And so I've enjoyed this discourse very much. I noted that we just have a few minutes more. I've enjoyed this discourse very much. And gentlemen.
I want to thank you, Ganga, for a very gracious response. But there are a couple points I'd like to make. The first thing you say is that we shouldn't kill the goose. I'm aware of properties in Georgetown that are worth $100 million, and the rates payable are $40,000 a year. Now, that is because the properties have been transformed from some little two-story building into an enormous, well-developed commercial building, but the rates are abysmally low. We're far, far away from killing the goose. We are seriously undervaluing, and we are starving City Hall. And what I can also say to you is that whatever information you have about the Chief Valuation Office conducting valuations, I'm afraid is not correct and not thorough. I have been involved in litigation before the court where there has been a specific finding that there has been default in that obligation to value every 5 years. And the latest valuation they were able to show dated back to the 1990s. I wasn't speaking carelessly. So if we have a situation where the valuations of properties are more than a quarter century old and do not take into account the fact that many old buildings have been torn down and large commercial buildings are up, and that many new areas that are now within the city limits are in fact not payable at all because of that dearth, that absence of valuation since then. We're asking the City Hall to make bricks without straw, and that is not tenable. And it is very obvious that the reason for that is that City Hall is not government supported and is not a supporter of government. We are back to tit-for-tat politics. So I'm very clear in my mind as to the reason for that. And I'm also very clear that we are far, far away from killing the goose. Now I hear what you say, that in the city boundaries, government has no place. I agree with you. I agree with that entirely. And I'll go further and say in the NDCs and the RDCs, those are the entities that should be dealing with roads and drains, not the government. But you will agree with me that we have seen a large city beautification project by the government in Georgetown. Now, it's hard to rationalize those two things. You starve City Hall, but you then want to take kudos for going to spend money in a beautification project using, as you say and as Kamani says, funds that really belong to the people but are being misspent because that project should be paid from properly assessed rates of the people who are living in the municipality and will be benefiting from it because they live there. That's not happening. We have dirty politics at play. But I would also like to respond to what Kimani is saying. You see, Kimani has adverted a number of occasions in this program to the Afro-Indo separation. And I was startled to hear you say that doesn't exist and we should ignore it, because that is the central tenet of the ethnic politics in Guyana, with an Afro party and an Indo party. That is the central tenet of Guyana politics. The fact that Guyanese get along so well outside of politics is a tribute to them. It is a condemnation of our leaders that we insist on continuing with ethnic politics. And it is only common sense that makes an Afro-Guyanese vote for the Afro Party and an Indo Party vote for the Indo Party, because of the very perception that Kamani just discussed, that, as he said, he sees a pump removed from his village and put in another village. But what I would like to say to Kamani in response is that it cuts two ways. Now, the example that I like to give, and you know, we have to speak the truth. We have to speak the truth because everyone recognizes the truth when they hear it. Housing development. Housing development has been the best project by the PPP in their 20-odd years in government. But there was housing development under the Burnham administration as well. And the self-help projects in Rumveld were where Burnham focused a housing development. If you walk through those areas, you have to look hard to find an Indo-Guyanese. You have to look hard to find one. Burnham's project did not help Guyanese equally. It was one-sided. And we have to speak the truth. And we have to say that if you look at the PPP projects in Eccles, in Horstelling, in Enterprise, you see all and sundry live in there. I have to say that the truth is that the PPP's approach to housing was much more even-handed than the PNC's previous approach to housing. But I will also equally say that the favoritism and ostracism and corruption and the family and friends that now exists is also ethnocentric. So that we can't just attribute it to one side. We have to acknowledge that the truth is both sides are culpable. Both sides are responsible. And as long as we have an Indo party and an Afro party, we will continue to have favoritism and we will continue to have ostracism. And the only possible solution is either we get rid of both or we acknowledge that to support either one, got to be harmful because it perpetuates the problem. And I want to say this also to Kimani. I am the son of Ronald Jonas, and he is the son of Ronald Murphy Jonas. And Ronald Murphy Jonas's grandfather was born in slavery up in Quarantine. So I equally can claim the legacy that you're claiming. My father married a European, and I have seen racism from both sides. And I've seen racism to both sides. It's not a one-way street. I am married to an Indo-Guyanese, and I have seen racism from both sides and racism to both sides. It is not a one-way street. And part of the discussion has got to be not to justify you or to blame them, but it has to be a recognition that where we are now is what we have to look at. Because I have had oppressors in my life, but my oppressors, I didn't live in the 1800s. I didn't live in World War II. My oppressors were Burnham's policies that destroyed our economy in the 70s, Burnham's policies that allowed a rigged election so that he could have his constitution in 1980. And that is also the truth. But for me, we have to acknowledge that our culture now is cook up and masala. And once we can recognize that both of those things are our culture, once we embrace that, then we move forward.
You've made, Tim, two false assumptions regarding me. I'm not a supporter of either the PNC or the PVP.
I never said so.
Well, it seems so to me, in the way in which you framed some of what you said in response to what I said. And I just want to say that part of the reason, a big part of the reason, perhaps the reason that I live outside of Guyana. It's because I've been forced to live outside of Guyana. And it's not by the PPP. So that's a piece of my personal history that I think should be tendered here. The other false assumption I think you made, Tim, is the notion that what happened in history doesn't concern us and shouldn't concern us. I'm going to make a statement here.
I never said that either. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I never said that either.
You seem close to saying that to me, and I'm glad that I misrepresented you there. I'm very glad about it, right? Because Guyanese people have too much still been imprisoned by structures that have been erected in our minds, our economy, and our society hundreds of years ago. And when I say that part of our problem is that we do not know enough about each other, it's because I'm pointing to that. When I started out by talking about the way in which our local government structures have not responded to its roots in the pre-1980 section of our history. That's what I mean too. Part of the disjuncture that we need to look at some other stage is how the 1980 Constitution has made assumptions that are false about the roots of our local government democracy. We have to look at how central governments, the colonial state as well as the neo-colonial state, were graduated in ways that are antagonistic to what was coming out from democratic processes in those villages and settlements of Guyana. I know that we need the time, and I want to say that part of our challenge is educating our citizens to be citizens of Guyana, to know their rights and their responsibilities, irrespective of race, color, and creed, but in ways that include and validate whatsoever is good and safe, what people need about their race, their color, and their creed. We run away from talking about our differences too much instead of acknowledging our genuine differences as platforms upon which we could proceed to deal honestly with each other.
Well, Kimani, Tim, it was wonderful discourse. Listening to both of you and learning so much from each and every one of you. And to our viewers, I say, have a wonderful evening. Gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Ganga. Can I also say that I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I learned a lot from you, and I enjoyed my discourse with you, Kimani. I really hope that the three of us can meet in a forum, this forum or another forum, and continue our quarrel. It was thoroughly enjoyed.
That's a Guyanese definition of quarrel. Well, I echo those sentiments. I look forward to a continuation of discussions such as these. I hope it will be in your elevated company and distinguished company otherwise. And I thought that it was a good discussion. I too enjoyed it, and I look forward to more of this. Thanks to Globespan, and thanks for all the enablers, technical and otherwise, as well as our listeners and viewers.